You think you know your children. You hold them as bobbies, you watch them take their first steps, you bandage their knees, and you lie to yourself that the goodness you see in their little hearts is what they're made of. You tell yourself the greed, the petty squabbles over a toy, the little white lies, that's just them learning. It'll fade. They'll grow out of it. I was a fool. I built an empire from nothing, from a borrowed truck and a back that didn't know the meaning of quit, not for the money, but for the legacy, for my family. I wanted to build a castle that would house the O'Shaughnessy name for generations. But a castle, it turns out, is just a fancy cage when you fill it with vultures. The day I signed my last will and testament was the day I set the stage for the final grand performance of their lives. And I was the ghost in the audience, watching it all. They didn't know I was watching. Not then. My lawyer, Alastair Finch, a man so dry he could start a fire in a rainforest, he looked at me over his spectacles and said, "Liam, they will tear each other apart. This is unorthodox." And I looked right back at him, my hand steady as stone as I signed my name. "Alastair," I said, "they were already tearing me apart, piece by piece. This way, at least I get to choose the soundtrack." You see, I didn't leave my company, my pride, my life's work to any one of them. Oh no. I left a controlling 51% stake to Alastair himself, to be held in a trust he would manage not for his own benefit but to eventually be bestowed upon. And I remember the phrase I crafted so carefully, the words that would become a poison in my family's veins, the most deserving heir. The other 49%, I scattered it amongst them like birdseed for pigeons, just enough to make them hungry, just enough to make them desperate. And the performance began, before the dirt was even settled on my coffin. I remember the first family meeting after the reading of the will. I was supposed to be napping upstairs, the frail old man, half gone already. But I stood at the top of the staircase, hidden in the shadows, and I listened. Oh God, I listened. And I felt my heart, which I thought had turned to granite, crack right down the middle. My eldest, Robert, his voice was like gravel being poured. "This is an outrage, a non-family member, that bloodsucker Finch. He's playing us for fools." And my daughter, Alina, always so composed, so icy, her voice cut through the room. "Don't be dramatic, Robert. It's a test. A simple, albeit tedious, test of character. We just have to demonstrate to Mr. Finch who the obvious choice is." Then came my youngest, Kyle, sweet Kyle, my boy who loved his books and his quiet. His voice was trembling and I could picture him wringing his hands. Maybe we could just ask Mr. Finch what grandfather meant. Maybe if we all just got along, for real. The silence that followed was colder than a tomb. Then Robert let out a short, ugly laugh. "Got along? Kyle, you naive little idiot. This isn't a summer picnic. This is a battlefield, and for real," he practically spat the words. "There is no for real anymore. There's only what Finch sees, so from now on we perform." And perform they did. For 10 long years I watched from my gilded cage. They moved me into the East Wing, a beautiful prison with a view of the gardens I could no longer tend to. And they began their dance. Robert, the dutiful son. He started visiting every Sunday without fail. He'd bring the financial papers, talk to me about market fluctuations and expansion opportunities. His voice always a little too loud, a little too clear, ensuring Alastair, who visited every Tuesday like clockwork, would hear about his dedication. He'd pat my shoulder, a gesture so stiff and unnatural it was like being touched by a store mannequin. "Looking strong, Dad," he'd say, his eyes already scanning the room, looking for Alastair's approval for any sign. One Sunday he brought his son, my grandson, little Sean. The boy was fidgeting, bored out of his mind. Robert shoved him towards me. "Go on, Sean, talk to your granddad. Tell him about your model airplanes." The boy mumbled something. I gave him a weak smile. And Robert, he leaned in close to me, but his voice was pitched for the open door, for the housekeeper he knew reported to Alastair. "See, Dad, family, it's all about family. That's what you built all this for, isn't it? The family." The hypocrisy of it was so thick I could taste it like copper on my tongue. I felt a surge of such pure, unadulterated rage that my vision blurred. This was my son, my firstborn, using his own child as a prop in his pathetic play for my money. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and backhand him across his smug face. But I didn't. I just closed my eyes and pretended to be tired. The performance, after all, required an audience, and the frail old man was the part I had to play. Then there was Alina, the caring daughter. Her strategy was more subtle, more insidious. She took charge of my well-being. She hired new nurses, firing the ones she deemed insufficiently attentive, always with a sigh and a concerned glance at Alistair. "We must ensure my father's comfort, Mr. Finch. His final years must be his best years." She'd sit with me for hours, reading from boring financial journals, her voice a soothing, monotonous drone. But her eyes were always calculating. She was curating an image of the selfless, intelligent heiress, the one who understood the business and cared for its founder. One afternoon, she was going through the mail, a daily ritual she'd appropriated. She opened a letter, her face a perfect mask of gentle concern. "Oh, Dad, it's another one of those charitable requests. The Northern Valley Orphanage. They're asking for a rather significant donation again." She paused, letting the silence hang. Then she looked over at Alistair, who was reviewing some documents in the corner. "Mr. Finch, perhaps we should consider it. It's what my father would have wanted. He was always so generous." I felt my stomach clench. The Northern Valley Orphanage. I'd never given them a dime in my life. She was fabricating a legacy of philanthropy for me, right in front of my face, to make herself look compassionate and honor my wishes. The sheer, brazen audacity of it took my breath away. She wasn't just performing, she was rewriting history and using my silent, helpless form as her pen. And Kyle, my poor Kyle, he tried. God, did he try. He'd visit not on a schedule but erratically, sometimes with dark circles under his eyes. He didn't bring business papers. He brought his guitar. He'd sit by the window and play these soft, melancholy tunes, songs he'd written himself. He'd talk to me, not at me, not for an audience. "I met a girl, Granddad," he whispered one evening, his voice thick with emotion. "Her name is Clara. She's everything. She's a teacher. She doesn't care about any of this." He gestured vaguely at the opulent room. "I think you'd really like her." He was the only one who seemed to see me, the man, not the prize, but the pressure was breaking him. I could see it. The constant competition with his siblings, their veiled insults, their manipulations, were grinding him down. He wanted the company, I think, not for the money, but for the validation. To prove he was worthy. To prove he was a true O'Shaughnessy. The tension in the house was a living thing, a thick, poisonous fog we all breathed. Family dinners, which Alina insisted upon to present a united front, were exercises in psychological torture. We were all seated, Robert at one end, me at the head, Alina to my right, Kyle to my left. The chandelier above the table seemed to tremble with the unspoken words hanging in the air. "So, Kyle," Robert began, sawing into his steak with unnecessary force. "Heard you were at the corporate office yesterday, chatting up the junior analysts, trying to build a grassroots campaign." Kyle flinched, his fork clinking softly against his plate. "I was just looking at the quarterly reports, Robert, trying to understand the shipping logistics." Alina took a delicate sip of wine. "A noble effort, little brother, but perhaps your time would be better spent here with Father. The personal touch is so important, don't you think? It's about loyalty, not ambition." She said the word ambition like it was a disease. Kyle's knuckles were white where he gripped his fork. "I'm not being ambitious, Ellie, I'm being involved. Or is that only allowed for you too?" "Involved," Robert scoffed. "You waltz in once a month, strum a few chords, and you think that makes you involved. I'm there every day in the trenches, making the deals that keep this family afloat. I'm the one doing the real work." "The real work," Kyle's voice rose, cracking with a pain that made my soul ache. "Or just the most visible work. You think I don't see what you're doing. You think Mr. Finch does? Mr. Finch sees a dedicated leader. Robert slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. He sees a man who puts this family first, not some dreamer who's going to run this company into the ground because he's too soft-hearted to make the hard decisions. Being heartless isn't a hard decision, Robert. It's just your default setting. Kyle shot back, his face flushed. Enough, Eleanor's voice was a whip crack. She looked between them, her eyes cold. This is precisely what Father sought to avoid. This squabbling, this lack of decorum. We are a family. We must act like one, especially now. Her gaze drifted meaningfully towards the empty chair where Alistair often sat during his Tuesday visits. The silence that fell was heavier than the shouting. They all looked at me, the silent patriarch, their eyes searching my slack, expressionless face for a sign, a flicker of approval or disapproval. I gave them nothing. I just stared at my plate, the food turning to ash in my mouth. I felt like a ghost at my own wake. That was the moment I truly understood the monster I had created. I had wanted to see their true colors, and by God, I was seeing them in blazing, horrific technicolor. But I had thought, in some foolish, hidden corner of my heart, that one of them, maybe Kyle, would rise above it, that the performance would eventually become real. But I was wrong, dead wrong. The performance only got darker, more desperate. Robert started making riskier business moves, trying to post huge profits to impress Alistair. Eleanor began a whispering campaign, planting subtle doubts about Robert's stability and Kyle's incompetence in the ears of the board members who still held some sway. And Kyle started to change. The light in his eyes began to dim, replaced by a hard, desperate glint. He started showing up in suits, talking about leveraged buyouts and market disruption. He was trying to become them to beat them, and it was killing the boy I loved. One Tuesday, Alistair was in my study, going over the trust documents as was our ritual. He never spoke to me about the family, not directly, but his reports were a chronicle of their war. Robert has initiated a hostile takeover of McAllister Shipping, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. It's a bold move, highly leveraged. If it fails, it could cost the company 20% of its value. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. I was trapped in this body, a prisoner, but my mind was sharp. Alistair knew it. Our communication was a language of blinks and gestures we had developed over the decade. He continued, Eleanor has scheduled a board meeting for next week. The agenda item is leadership continuity and familial stability. She has requested I attend. Another nod. The chess pieces were moving, and I was the player who had set the board but could no longer touch the pieces. Then Alistair did something he rarely did. He paused, looked up from his papers, and met my gaze. His dry, lawyerly facade seemed to soften, just for a fraction of a second. Kyle, he said, and the name hung in the air. He has submitted a formal proposal to me, for the company. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I blinked once slowly. Go on. It's a proposal to sell. The words hit me like a physical blow. Sell my life's work, the castle I built. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, caged bird. Alistair's voice was low, almost a whisper. He's found a private equity firm. The offer is substantial. He argues that the infighting is destroying the company's value and that a clean break is the only way to preserve the financial legacy for everyone. He says it's the only just outcome. Justice? He was calling this justice. Selling my dream, my name, to a bunch of soulless suits who would carve it up and sell it for parts. This was his answer. This was the culmination of a decade of watching his children debase themselves. A cold, hard fury, colder than anything I had ever felt, began to crystallize inside me. This had gone too far. The experiment was over. The performance had reached its final, tragic act, and it was about to burn my entire legacy to the ground. I looked at Alistair, and my eyes, for the first time in years, held a clear, unmistakable command. I gestured weakly with my hand towards the desk drawer where I kept my old stationery. A pen. I needed a pen. Alastair, understanding, opened the drawer and placed a heavy, fountain pen in my trembling hand. He positioned a single, crisp sheet of paper in front of me. My hand shook, not from weakness but from the sheer, volcanic force of the will I was pouring into the movement. I leaned forward, every muscle in my back screaming in protest. I pressed the nib to the paper, and I began to write, the first words I had written in 10 years. The ink was dark, the lines shaky but legible. My true will. Alastair watched, his face an unreadable mask, but I saw the faintest gleam in his eyes. He knew. The game was changing. The ghost was stepping out of the shadows. I wrote for what felt like an hour, the scratch of the pen the only sound in the room. When I was finished, I dropped the pen, my strength utterly spent. I slumped back in my chair, breathing heavily. Alastair picked up the paper. He read it slowly, his eyebrows rising slightly. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I gave one final, definitive nod. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his inside jacket pocket. "I understand, Liam," he said softly. "It will be done." He turned and left the room, leaving me alone with the thunderous silence and the echo of my own devastating decision. I had set them against each other, and now I was about to throw a lit match into the powder keg. Because what I had just written, what I had just set in motion, wasn't a choice between them. It was a judgment on them all. And the revelation I had just unleashed was going to shatter my family into a million pieces. And the first crack, the one that would start it all, was the sound of my study door opening just as Alastair was leaving, and my daughter Eleanor's voice, sharp as a shard of glass, cutting through the quiet. "Mr. Finch," she said, her voice dripping with a suspicion she couldn't contain. "What was that? What were you and my father doing in here, alone?" That sound, the turn of the doorknob, the sharp, suspicious tone in Eleanor's voice, it's etched into my memory, sharper than the date on my own tombstone. In that single moment, the carefully constructed world of whispers and performances shattered into a silent, screaming panic. Alastair Finch, to his credit, didn't even flinch. He was a fortress of a man. He simply turned, his body blocking her view of me, of the pen still lying on the desk, of the faint scent of ink in the air. "Miss O'Shaughnessy," he said, his voice as dry and neutral as a legal brief. "Your father and I were reviewing some of the older trust documents. Estate tax law is a perpetual puzzle." It was a flawless lie. But Eleanor was Robert, all bluster and noise. She was a scalpel. She saw everything. She saw the faint sheen of sweat on my forehead, the way my hand still trembled slightly by my side, the unusual energy in the room. She didn't believe him, not for a second. "At this hour?" she asked, her voice sweetly laced with poison. It seemed rather intense for a simple review. "Is everything quite all right with the trust, Mr. Finch? Nothing that would affect the family's understanding of my father's wishes?" She was probing, her eyes darting past him, trying to see me, to read the truth in my slumped form. I let my eyes drift shut, feigning the exhaustion that was, for once, completely real. The act was back on, but the stakes had just skyrocketed. "The trust is perfectly sound," Alastair replied, his tone implying the conversation was over. He stepped past her, a man moving with a new purpose. "Good evening, Miss O'Shaughnessy." The door clicked shut behind him, and Eleanor stood there for a long moment. I could feel her gaze on me, hot and calculating. She didn't say a word to me. She didn't need to. The silence was a scream. Then I heard the quick, sharp click of her heels on the marble floor, receding down the hall. She was going to sound the alarm. The game was up. Or rather, a new, more dangerous game had begun. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in silent, simmering paranoia. The house, always tense, became a pressure cooker. Robert canceled a business trip to Frankfurt. Kyle stopped coming by altogether, which worried me more than anything. Eleanor moved through the halls like a ghost, her phone constantly pressed to her ear, her conversations hushed and urgent. They knew something had happened in that study. They just didn't know what, and the not knowing was eating them alive from the inside out. It all came to a head 2 nights later, another family dinner. This one wasn't for show. This one was a war council. I was wheeled into the dining room, the same grand table, the same trembling chandelier. But the air was different. It was charged, electric with fear and aggression. Robert was already there, a glass of whiskey in his hand, half empty. He didn't look at me. He was staring at the door, waiting. Alina came in, cool and composed in a steel gray dress, but her knuckles were white as she clutched her clutch bag. And then Kyle arrived. He looked wrecked. His clothes were rumpled, his hair a mess. There was a wild, desperate look in his eyes that I'd never seen before. He didn't sit. He stood at the end of the table, facing Robert. "Where have you been?" Robert snarled, not even bothering with a greeting. "None of your business," Kyle shot back, his voice raw. "It is my business when you're sneaking around, undermining this family." Robert slammed his glass down, whiskey sloshing over the side. "Finch was here, with Dad, alone. Alina saw them. What do you know about it?" Kyle's eyes widened in genuine confusion, then narrowed in anger. "Me? What would I know? You're the one who's always whispering in his ear, always trying to look like the big man. Maybe you finally overplayed your hand, Robert. Maybe he told Finch to cut you out." "Don't be absurd," Alina interjected, her voice cutting through their rising voices. She remained seated, the picture of calm, but her spine was rigid. "This is not the time for baseless accusations. We need to be rational. Mr. Finch was in with Father for over an hour. They were writing. I'm certain of it." The word writing hung in the air, sucking all the sound out of the room. Robert paled. "Writing? Writing what?" "I don't know," Alina said, her gaze shifting to me. I kept my face a blank slate, my eyes focused on a crack in the far wall. But it was something significant. I could feel it. "It's him," Kyle whispered, his voice trembling with a terrible certainty. He pointed a shaking finger at Robert. "He's done something. He's pressured Finch, or he's found some way to contest the will. He's trying to steal it from us." "I'm not stealing anything," Robert roared, launching to his feet. The vein in his temple was throbbing. "I'm the one holding this family together. I'm the one who's been here, day in and day out, protecting our birthright from SCAVNGRS like you." "My birthright?" Kyle's voice broke into a shrill, painful laugh. "You think this is about birthright? You think I wanted any of this? You turned this family into a gladiator arena. I just wanted him to be proud of me." He looked at me then, a look of such utter, profound betrayal that I felt it like a physical blow to my chest. "But he's not even in there anymore, is he? He's just a prop, a prize, and we're the monkeys dancing for it." "Don't you dare!" Alina stood now, her composure finally cracking. "Don't you dare play the wounded saint, Kyle. We've all played the game. You with your guitar and your pathetic little stories trying to prove you were the sensitive soul. Don't think we didn't see what you were doing. You were just worse at it than we were." "I wasn't playing," Kyle screamed, and the sound was torn from the very core of him. Tears were streaming down his face now. "I loved him. I actually loved him, which is more than I can say for either of you. You're vultures. You've been picking at his bones for 10 years, and now you're scared you might not get the biggest piece." The silence that followed was absolute. The truth, raw and ugly, was finally out in the open, lying on the polished mahogany table like a gutted animal. Robert was breathing heavily, his fists clenched. Alina had gone pale, her lips a thin, bloodless line. Kyle stood there, shoulders heaving, spent. It was Robert who spoke first, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "The sale." Kyle froze. "What?" "The private equity firm," Robert said, taking a step towards him. "The one you brought to Finch, the one you want to sell our father's life's work to. Was that your move? Was that what you were doing while Finch was in here with Dad, cutting a side deal, selling us all out?" The pieces clicked into place in their minds. I could see it happening. The suspicion, the betrayal, all coalescing around Kyle's proposal. "No, that's not," Kyle stammered, looking from Robert's furious face to Alina's icy stare. That was a different thing. That was before. I was desperate. I thought it was the only way to stop this madness." "Convenient," Alina whispered, the word dripping with venom. "You propose to dismantle the company, and days later Finch is in a secret meeting with Father. What did you do, Kyle? What did you promise him?" "I didn't do anything," he cried out, his voice cracking with desperation. He looked at me again, pleading. "Granddad, please, please say something. Tell them I wouldn't do that." And in that moment I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to stand up and end it. To wrap my arms around my broken grandson and tell him I knew. I knew he was the only one who had ever truly cared. But I couldn't. The mechanism of revenge I had set in motion had its own gravity now, its own terrible momentum. If I stopped it, it would all have been for nothing. The decade of lies, the performances, the slow erosion of our souls, it would have no meaning. So I did nothing. I said nothing. I just stared past him, my face a mask of senile indifference. I saw the hope in his eyes die. It was like watching a light get snuffed out. The last flicker of the boy I knew vanished, replaced by a hollow, empty man. He took a staggering step back from the table. "I see," he said, his voice a dead, flat thing. "I finally see." He looked at Robert, then at Alina. "You've won. You finally turned him into exactly what you wanted, a shell, a signature, congratulations." He turned and walked out of the room, and the sound of the front door slamming shut echoed through the house like a gunshot. The performance was over. The real war had begun. In the days that followed, the house became a fortress under siege, but the enemy was within. Robert and Alina stopped speaking to each other entirely. They communicated through terse emails, even though they lived under the same roof. The staff were terrified, tiptoeing around, caught in the crossfire of their silent, seething hatred. Robert doubled down on his dutiful son act, but it had a frantic, desperate edge. He started bringing in doctors, specialists, talking loudly about new treatments and breakthroughs, trying to prove his unwavering commitment. He was like a man trying to plug a leaking dam with his fingers. Alina, meanwhile, went on the offensive. She had Alistair's office flooded with reports on Robert's risky business ventures, on his temper with staff, on his unstable character. She was building a case, a meticulous, legalistic assassination of her own brother's credibility. And Kyle was gone, truly gone. He didn't answer calls. He didn't come to the house. The only news I got of him was through Alistair, whose Tuesday visits became my only window to the outside world. "Kyle has formally withdrawn his proposal to sell," Alistair told me one Tuesday, his voice as impassive as ever. His lawyer cited a change in personal circumstances. I blinked slowly. "What is he doing?" "I do not know, Liam," Alistair said, reading my unspoken question. "But he has taken a leave of absence from his position at the company. He's untraceable for the moment." A cold dread began to pool in my stomach. This wasn't Kyle giving up. This was Kyle regrouping. This was the quiet before the storm. The sweet, sensitive boy was gone. What was left in his place? I had no idea, and that terrified me more than all of Robert's bluster and Alina's schemes combined. I had wanted to see their true selves. I was about to see Kyle's, and I had a sickening feeling I wasn't going to like what I saw. The catalyst came 3 weeks later. It was a Tuesday, of course. Alistair was with me, and we heard the raised voices from the foyer. Robert and Alina, their fragile truce shattered. "You spiteful witch," Robert was bellowing. "You think you can freeze me out of the operating budget? I am the CEO. A title you hold at the pleasure of the board, which is influenced by the major shareholder, which is Mr. Finch." Alina fired back, her voice like shattering ice. "And I have made it very clear to him that your leadership is a liability. That shipping deal in the Pacific is a disaster waiting to happen. It's a masterstroke. It will double our Pacific revenue." It will bankrupt us if a single container ship hits a storm. You're gambling with Father's legacy, and you're trying to strangle it with your bureaucratic cowardice. Their voices were getting closer. They were moving towards the study, towards us. Alistair looked at me, a question in his eyes. I gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of my head. Let them come. The door flew open, crashing against the wall. Robert stood there, red-faced and heaving. Eleanor was just behind him, her face a mask of cold fury. "Finch," Robert barked, storming into the room. "This ends now. I demand to know what is going on. What did he jabbed a finger in my direction, tell you to write that night?" Eleanor stepped beside him, her arms crossed. "Yes, Mr. Finch. The family has a right to know. The secrecy has become untenable." Alistair remained seated, steepling his fingers. "Your father's affairs are a matter of strict confidentiality. You know this." "I don't care about confidentiality," Robert screamed, spittle flying from his lips. "I care about my company, my future. Is there a new will? Did he change it? Tell me." It was then that a calm, quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "He doesn't have to." We all turned. Kyle stood there. He was clean-shaven, wearing a simple dark suit. He looked calm, terribly, unnervingly calm. But his eyes were like chips of flint. All the softness was gone. He held a small, sealed manila envelope in his hand. "Kyle," Eleanor said, her voice wary, "what is the meaning of this?" "I've been doing some reading," Kyle said, stepping into the room. He didn't look at me. His gaze was fixed on Robert and Eleanor. About the law, about trusts, and about medical conditions. A cold finger of fear traced its way down my spine. "What are you talking about?" Robert scoffed, though he looked uneasy. "I'm talking about the fact that for 10 years we've all been performing for Mr. Finch," Kyle said, his voice even and measured, "trying to prove who was the most deserving heir. We based our entire lives on a single premise, that grandfather was incapable, that he was a hollow shell, that his mind was gone." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "But what if it was?" he asked softly. He turned and finally looked directly at me, and for the first time in a decade I didn't look away. I met his gaze. I let him see the intelligence, the awareness, the person still screaming inside this useless body. I saw the shock register on Robert's and Eleanor's faces. They saw it too. The truth laid bare in a single, unguarded look. "Oh my God," Eleanor whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "You," Robert stammered, his face draining of all color. "You've been in there this whole time." Kyle gave a slow, grim nod. "He's been in there, listening, watching, judging, every lie, every manipulation, every pathetic, groveling performance." He held up the manila envelope. "And I have the proof. A full, independent neurological and psychological evaluation conducted by a specialist I brought in last week. It concludes beyond any doubt that grandfather Liam O'Shaughnessy has been of sound mind and fully aware of his surroundings for the entire duration of this so-called trust." The revelation exploded in the room with the force of a bomb. Robert looked like he'd been shot. He staggered back, collapsing into a chair, his mouth agape. Eleanor simply stared at me, her eyes wide with a horror that was so complete, it was almost beautiful. She wasn't seeing her frail father anymore. She was seeing her judge, her jury, and the witness to every single one of her crimes. The performance was over. The audience had just stood up and revealed himself to be the director. Kyle walked over to Alistair and handed him the envelope. "This corroborates what I believe you already suspected, Mr. Finch. The trust, the performance for the most deserving heir, it was a sham, a cruel game, and we all failed." He turned back to his siblings. "He saw it all. He saw you, Robert, using your own son as a prop. He heard you, Eleanor, inventing a philanthropic history for him to make yourself look good. And he saw me. He saw me try to sell his life's work out from under him." He finally looked at me, and the pain in his eyes was so raw, it was almost unbearable. "We all betrayed you, Granddad. in our own special ways. The silence was absolute. The only sound was Robert, ragged breathing. Then Alastair Finch spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "The document Liam wrote that night," he said, looking at each of my children in turn. "It was not a new will." He let that hang in the air for a moment, watching the confusion and dawning hope on their faces. "It was a set of instructions for me, to be enacted upon the confirmation of his mental competency." He turned his gaze to me, "which we now have." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out the single sheet of paper I had scrawled upon. He unfolded it with a slow, deliberate motion. "Liam O'Shaughnessy's final judgment is as follows," Alastair announced, his voice resonating with legal finality. "The trust is hereby dissolved. The controlling 51% share of the O'Shaughnessy Corporation does not go to Robert, Eleanor, or Kyle." He looked up, his eyes cold. "It goes to the company itself, to be held in a perpetual employee stock ownership plan. The O'Shaughnessy family from this day forward are minority shareholders. The company is no longer yours." The sound that came from Robert was a guttural, animalistic cry of pure despair. Eleanor made no sound at all. She just stood there, frozen, her entire world, her life's purpose, turning to dust before her eyes. "Justice, I had thought it would taste sweet. It tasted like ashes." But Alastair wasn't finished. He looked down at the paper again. "There is one final clause," he said, "regarding the dispersal of his remaining personal assets, the estate, the art, the liquid funds." He looked directly at Kyle. "Liam bequeaths it all, every last penny, to his grandson, Kyle O'Shaughnessy." The room spun. Robert shot to his feet. "What?" "He stipulates," Alastair continued, overriding him, "that it is not a reward. It is a burden. It is because Kyle was the only one who ever looked at him and saw a man and not a prize, and because he was the one brave enough or desperate enough to finally expose the truth and end the charade." Kyle stared at me, his face a tumult of emotions: shock, gratitude, horror, and a deep, overwhelming sadness. I had done it. I had broken them. I had taken everything they fought for and given it to the one who had stopped fighting. I had punished the greedy and rewarded the least worst, the one who betrayed me last. I had wanted a deserving heir, and in the end, I created a situation where there could be none. As Robert began screaming incoherently, as Eleanor finally broke down into silent, shuddering sobs, and as Kyle stood rooted to the spot, holding the weight of a fortune he never wanted, I realized the terrible, devastating truth of my revenge. I had won, and I had never, in my entire life, felt like more of a failure. The castle was quiet. The vultures were stripped of their prey, but the man who built the castle was left alone in the silence, with nothing but the echoes of his own monstrous design, and the chilling knowledge that the final and most devastating betrayal was yet to come, from the one I had just anointed as my sole heir. You thought the story was over, didn't you? The old man had his revenge, the vultures were scattered, and the good grandson, the one with a heart, was rewarded. A neat, moral little ending. I told you I was a fool, but I am a fool who learns. The silence after Alastair finished speaking was more deafening than any scream. Robert was catatonic, slumped in his chair, his face a slack mask of utter ruin. Eleanor had crumpled into herself, her elegant frame shaking with silent, violent sobs that seemed to tear her apart from the inside. The performance was over, and the actors had forgotten their lines, their roles, their very reason for being. And Kyle, my Kyle, he didn't look triumphant. He looked haunted. He stared at the document in Alastair's hand as if it were a death warrant, which, in a way, it was. "The personal assets," he whispered, his voice rough. "The house is this house, the art, I don't want it." "It is not a question of want, Mr. O'Shaughnessy," Alastair said, his tone devoid of comfort. "It is the directive of the estate's sole benefactor." He placed the paper carefully back into his briefcase and clicked the locks shut. The sound was as final as a coffin lid closing. That should have been the end. But I had one more role to play. The decade of silence had been a cage, but it had also been a shield. Now the shield was gone. I took a slow, deliberate breath, feeling my unused vocal cords like rusty hinges. I leaned forward in my chair, my movements no longer the shaky tremors of an invalid, but the deliberate, stiff actions of an old man who has been waiting for a very, very long time. "It's not about what you want, Kyle," I said. My voice. It wasn't the weak whisper they might have expected. It was low, gravelly from disuse, but firm, absolutely firm. The effect was nuclear. Robert's head snapped up as if he'd been electrocuted. Eleanor's sobs choked off into a strangled gasp. Her eyes, wide and red-rimmed, locked onto me, filled with a terror that was almost religious. Kyle took an involuntary step back, his hand flying to his chest. You can speak," Robert stammered, his jaw unhinged. "I've always been able to speak, Robert," I said, my gaze sweeping over them. "I simply chose not to. The view was better from the silence." The sheer, unvarnished truth of it was a second, more devastating blow. They had been so sure of their narrative, the doddering old man, the hollow shell. This was an impossibility, a violation of the natural order they had built their lives upon. Eleanor found her voice first, a thin, reedy thing. "All of it, you heard all of it." "Every single word," I replied, punctuating each word with the cold finality of a hammer striking stone. "The calculations in the kitchen, the manipulations in the garden, the whispered lies in the hall. I heard Robert tell his wife, 'The old bastard can't last another winter.' I heard you, Eleanor, instruct your lawyer on how to contest the will the very day of my funeral, a funeral you had already planned down to the floral arrangements. And I heard you, Kyle." I turned my full attention to him, and he flinched as if I'd struck him. "I heard you tell Clara that you were playing the long game, that your siblings were amateur actors in a tragedy they didn't understand." The color drained from Kyle's face. "Granddad, that was just me venting. I was angry." "Weren't we all?" I interrupted, my voice dangerously soft. "But you see, that's the poison, isn't it? You weren't just venting, you were strategizing. You were just better at hiding it than they were. Your performance was the most convincing of all because you almost believed it yourself." I stood up. It was a struggle. My legs were weak, my back screamed in protest, but I pushed through it, leaning heavily on the desk. I would not give this speech sitting down. "You think I gave you everything, Kyle, because you were the good one, because you saw the man and not the prize." I let out a short, bitter laugh. "I gave it to you because you were the most like me." The silence in the room was absolute. You could have heard a dust mite breathe. "You think I built this empire with kindness, with guitar songs and soft-hearted pleas. I built it with ruthlessness. I built it by seeing the angles others missed. I built it by being willing to do what others wouldn't. You uncovered the truth about my competency not out of some noble quest for justice, but as a weapon. A calculated, brilliant, ruthless move. You went for the jugular. You didn't try to win the game. You exposed the game itself and set the board on fire." I looked at my 3 children, their worlds, their very selves, shattered at my feet. "Robert, you are a blunt instrument. All force, no finesse. You would have run my company into the ground within 5 years, chasing glory. Eleanor, you are a parasite. You don't build. You attach yourself to strength and manipulate it. You would have bled the company dry with bureaucracy and sold the pieces for a profit." "And Kyle," I sighed, a sound of genuine, profound weariness. "Kyle, you have the mind for it, the cunning, the patience. You proved that, but you lack the one thing that kept my own ruthlessness in check." I paused, letting the suspense build, watching the confusion and dread in their eyes. "What?" Kyle whispered, his voice barely audible. "Consequence," I said simply. "You never faced a real consequence for your manipulations, until now." I nodded to Alistair. He opened his briefcase once more and produced 3 smaller, sealed envelopes. He handed one to Robert, one to Alina, and one to Kyle. "The personal fortune I bequeath to you, Kyle, is not unconditional," I said. "Open it." With trembling hands, Kyle broke the seal. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. His eyes scanned it once, twice, not comprehending. Then the blood drained from his face so completely I thought he would faint. It's all debt," he choked out. "Margin calls, leveraged buyouts against my shares, against the personal assets." He looked up at me, his eyes wide with horror. You used my own proposal against me. The private equity firm, the loans I took out to try and buy Robert's shares last year, you guaranteed them. You're calling them in." "I am the sole guarantor," I confirmed calmly. "The terms are now due, in full. The value of the personal assets I just gave you covers approximately half of the debt. You are, as of this moment, personally bankrupt." The twist, the final, unexpected knife slid home. I hadn't rewarded him. I had given him a crown of thorns and a kingdom of ash. I had taken his own ambition, his own secret, desperate gamble for power, and turned it into the instrument of his destruction. "Why," he gasped, the paper fluttering from his nerveless fingers, "why would you do this?" "Because you needed to learn," I said, my voice cold as the grave. "You needed to understand that every action, every hidden scheme, every whispered betrayal has a price that must be paid in full. Your siblings' price was their inheritance. Your price is everything else." I turned to Robert and Alina. "Your envelopes contain the details of your minority stakes. You will receive dividends enough to live comfortably, but you will have no voice, no power. You are spectators now. I suggest you get used to the view." The justice was complete. It was not the justice they deserved, perhaps. It was the justice they had shaped for themselves through a decade of their own actions. I had merely been the architect, building the prison from the bricks of their own greed. I walked slowly, painfully towards the door. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. "Alistair," I said without turning, "see to the details." "Of course, Liam," he replied. I left them there. The blusterer, the manipulator, and the cunning heir, broken not by my hand, but by the reflection of their own souls I had held up for them to see. I moved out of the castle that week. I bought a small, quiet cottage by the sea, a place with no memories, no ghosts, no whispering corridors. The company thrived under the employee ownership plan, more profitable than ever. Robert moved to a tax haven, a bitter man writing furious memoirs no one would ever publish. Alina opened a small art gallery, a hollow echo of her former aspirations. And Kyle, he worked. He paid off his debts dollar by dollar, starting from nothing. He didn't come to see me. I didn't expect him to. A year to the day after the reading of the final judgment, a letter arrived. The handwriting was his. I opened it, my hand steady. It contained a single sheet of paper, no plea for forgiveness, no accusation, no justification. It was a balance sheet, a meticulously kept record of every debt he had owed, every payment he had made. At the bottom, in bold black ink, was a single word: paid. And below that, a short sentence: "You were right, the price is paid, I am free." I read it once, then folded the letter and placed it in the fireplace. I watched the flames consume it, turning the paper to ash, the ink to smoke. I had wanted a deserving heir. In the end, I had to create one, not by giving him a kingdom, but by making him build his own from the ground up. I had to break him completely to show him who he could be. The castle was quiet, the vultures were gone, and the old man by the sea finally was at peace. The legacy was not a company or a fortune. It was a lesson, written in fire and paid for in full. And that was a story worth telling.